Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In today's episode, Andrea Charron, Rob Huebert, Jim Fergusson, Bob Davidson, and Michel Lalumiere discuss the pressing need for NORAD modernization, emphasizing concerns about Arctic security, ballistic missile defense, and gaps in maritime security. The panel focuses on the importance of a strategic shift in planning for continental defense, recognizing the growing significance of space and cyber domains, as well as the need to address urgent security issues in the Arctic region, which include the impact of climate change on infrastructure, the potential exploitation of vulnerabilities by foreign actors, and the need for prioritized investments in both civilian infrastructure and military modernization efforts. This episode is comprised of interviews that took place between June to September 2023. This is the Expert Series. To begin this episode, we'll first turn to Dr. Andrea Charron, Director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Andrea, thanks again for joining the CDA Institute. To begin the discussion, what would you say are some of the most pressing security concerns in the Canadian Arctic right now, given our aging infrastructure and in the context of great power competition involving China, Russia, the US, and so forth? Has the geostrategic significance of the Arctic changed since the implementation of SSE?
Well, that's a lot to unpack. And so I want to use a tool that Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer has developed, and that's to break down the direction of the threats. So to think about threats through the Arctic, in the Arctic, and to the Arctic, as opposed to just saying there are all sorts of threats and, it's connected to the Arctic. Because I think it's really the threats in the Arctic that are more pressing. I think often, and you referenced it in the question, we know that we have geostrategic competition, and so, we're concerned about the intentions of China and Russia, and therefore it's a slippery slope to conflict in the Arctic. Except for that, those are threats through the Arctic. We have NORAD, which is nearly 65 years old and has, a lot of experience tracking aerospace and maritime threats coming toward North America. Typically it was via the Arctic as the sort of fastest route to many of the American and Canadian targets. But it's the climate change effects that we're seeing at the Arctic. We know they're at 3 to 4 times faster in the Arctic at the poles. So we have changes to infrastructure, what little infrastructure there is. And then in terms of security threats in the Arctic, because there is so little infrastructure, because there isn't reliable internet in some places, because we now have just one deep water port in the form of the new dock in Iqaluit, this lends itself to opportunities for foreign actors like China to say, because the government of Canada for decades seems reluctant to spend any sort of money on community infrastructure in the Arctic, we will do it for you. And so I really think we have to break down the different types of threats. And for me, it is still the lack of housing, the lack of accessible food at a cost that people can afford, the lack of opportunities for employment. And of course, this is all exacerbated by the fact that basic infrastructure that Southern Canadians take for granted is often missing in the Arctic.
What are some of the operational and logistical challenges that the unique conditions and climate of the High North pose for security? And what strategies or approaches have been developed to overcome these challenges, and can they be further strengthened in any way?
One of the first challenges is the distance that has to be traveled. And so when we have Operation Nanook, which is a series of 4 exercises a year, everything that the Canadian Armed Forces needs for the exercises has to be flown up there because there are no roads, there's no train system. So everything has to be airlifted into the Arctic. It also means that any waste that the CAF produces on these exercises has to be flown back. It's things like making sure there's enough fuel for the exercises that doesn't take away from the community's supply, because especially in the Eastern Arctic, they're sort of supplied by sea lift in the summer. And so if the Canadian Armed Forces is depending on using food or fuel supplies, in Nunavut, that is taking away supplies from Canadians living there. So, the operational and logistical challenges, I think, are mostly because of the distance, and then because we don't have the redundancy civilian systems up there. There are no big hospitals. There are no roads. There's not reliable internet. And so you have to come as quite a self-sufficient unit when you come up there. In terms of strategies or approaches that have been developed to overcome these challenges, I think that's still a work in progress. One of the things that the Canadian Armed Forces has done, rather than having just one exercise that used to be in the fall, and so the conditions were sometimes a little bit easier to plan for, the Canadian Armed Forces has a series of 4 exercises through the entire year. And so you're not just practicing what it's like to operate in the fall, it's in the deep winter, in the summer, and also in all domains. So land, sea, and then of course NORAD often has exercises for the aerospace. It's now a matter of funding. We know that the government of Canada is under fiscal pressure, and so everybody's going to have to plan exercises very, very carefully. Are we exercising the capabilities and readiness aspects that are most important to the CAF operating in the Arctic? Maybe there are ways to work with allies to combine training opportunities and exercise opportunities. So I think this is, going to be the future going forward.
Given the fact that the Arctic infrastructure is deteriorating, what specific investments and modernization efforts should Canada be prioritizing?
Well, I would like to see the government of Canada really prioritizing the civilian infrastructure that communities need. But that, it's been decades, and that seems a really tough struggle. And so the emphasis has been placed on things like NORAD modernization, which is a whole series of projects, command and control changes. It's really about continental defense writ large. And so there is certainly an Arctic component, things like over-the-horizon backscatter radar that will allow us to track and cue potential targets much further out from North America, which is always helpful. But there's also a concern that we're trying to download on the CAF responsibility for providing infrastructure for communities, which is not in their mandate. So, for example, Iqaluit had a lack of clean drinking water, potable water, because there was contamination of the main water supply. The CAF cannot provide that service indefinitely. They certainly assisted with some of the remedial efforts, but things like the over-the-horizon backscatter radar will not come with new schools, will not come with the money to improve communications systems. And so the modernization attempts wherever possible, like forward operating locations in the Arctic and extending runways, we're trying to be multi-purpose, multi-use, so that there is a benefit to communities writ large, and as well as meeting military needs. But this idea that the NORAD modernization projects are going to reform and revolutionize communities in the Arctic is patently false. And we need continued investment in civilian infrastructure. we saw this really clearly with the fires in Yellowknife and the fact that there was only one road leading in and out of that city. And so certainly that road is likely to need repairing. But there are very few roads across much of our Arctic, and that basic civilian infrastructure then doesn't allow communities to develop economically.
Andrea, you've been great. Are there any other insights that we didn't touch on regarding NORAD modernization or infrastructure or Arctic security more broadly that you think is important to raise for our audience?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to hear more and more about NORAD and NATO in the same breath, and the possibility of new partners in NORAD in the future. And that is going to sound really jarring, especially when Canadians don't really understand what NORAD does. I think they often forget there's a maritime warning mission that NORAD has. And on the NATO side, we often think of activities happening over in Europe or elsewhere, and NORAD does things over here in North America, especially tracking Santa. But it's actually working together, sharing more information between these two important commands, making sure that we're not leaving North America vulnerable, because the last thing we want to do is have all our NATO allies have to shift and pivot from support to the Eastern Europe to come and help Canada and the US and North America. So NORAD is very much a contribution to NATO, and we're going to hear, I hope, more references to them working together. And then partners like Denmark, the United Kingdom, Iceland, these important NATO allies, more and more being part of a discussion about the defense of North America.
Andrea, thank you once again for your insights and for your time. Next, we will turn to Dr. Rob Huebert, Interim Director for the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies at University of Calgary. Rob, thanks for being with us again. Let's dive right in, shall we? What would you say is the current state of NORAD and continental defense, and how would you say it aligns with the current SSE framework?
Canada, if we're being honest, we last have the modernization in 1985 when the DEW line is converted into the North Warning System. We have ongoing updates. There's no question whatsoever. We're not just simply using 1985 technology. There are significant upgrades that are occurring, but once again, they're incremental. They're not really looking at the overall threat. What we see in 2022 is, of course, the realization by the government that it needed to get serious on what it said it was going to do back in NORAD, back in Strong, Secure, and Engaged. And so we see basically a bit of a shopping list, one could almost argue, in terms of the various issues that were most pressing. Now, where did that list come from? Did it come from the plannings that perhaps Strong, Secure, and Engaged left the senior Canadian military to deal with? In other words, it's entirely conceivable, but once again, because there is so lack of any transparency on defense issues within this government, it's hard to know with any certainty, but it may have been that even though no monies was provided, the senior leadership was told to develop the plans that if we ever get around to actually funding what we said we're going to do, we will do it. So once again, that is a possibility, and we can hope that that was where it was going. But nevertheless, once the second phase of the Ukrainian war starts and everybody realizes what a threat that Putin actually is, and you then add in the recognition of the weapon systems, hypersonics and others, but you also have Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons. And so that whole validity of what drives NORAD and for the protection of North American aerospace becomes all that clear finally to everybody. And within that context, now we see the efforts of trying to extend through over-the-horizon radar, relatively mature technology, one might add, but still one is necessary to see as far as possible, or such things such as the hypersonics that have an increased speed and stealth capability. And so we see that. We see better, an effort to integrate in terms of satellites. But once again, if we go to the Auditor General's report, says that there really aren't any real plans to replace the existing satellite system that we have. Now, presumably, when the minister was making her announcement back in June of last year, really what she was talking about is linking up with the American system, because it's hard to find if Canada is doing, if the Auditor General's report is accurate on this, which I believe it is. And so we see an effort to meet some of the most important threats that the Americans have identified. The one point I will just sort of finish on this phase of discussion is, of course, that there is absolutely no mention of maritime security. And we know that when the Russians were bragging about the hypersonics, when they're bragging about their Asgard missiles and such, they're also bragging about Poseidon, which of course is an autonomous underwater torpedo vehicle, whatever you want to call, nuclear capability, represents new types of threats. All of this, of course, illustrates the growing complexity and capability that the Russians do have. We also have to add that June 28th, we had the Chinese announcing that they had cut steel on their third icebreaker, and they point out that they expect to have it operational in 2025, and it will be outfitted with deep diving submarines, both manned and unmanned, akin to what the Russians utilized to drop a flag at the North Pole back in 2006, 2007. Bottom line, we seem to be making progress, at least in the planning phases, for meeting the aerospace threat better. We're doing absolutely nothing at this point, at least publicly, where nothing is being signaled that we're doing anything from a maritime perspective. I think one of the most important issues, and it perhaps is one of the most dangerous issues, are the manner in which we see repeatedly the effort of our political leadership to create the false narrative that somehow we're not as much a threat as say the Europeans. I mean, we saw that in the recent Senate report that just came out. They talk about the difference between the threat to the European Arctic as opposed to the Canadian Arctic. And there is, of course, this narrative that unfortunately began when Chief of Defense Staff Nishchinchuk started making this very, what I think was an ill-informed joke, that if the Russians ever were to invade, his biggest concern would be to go rescue them. And so I think we've started believing that joke. I think that one of the biggest risks that we have is that we don't take the defense of North America as a serious threat. We're doing it because the Americans take it as a serious threat, but I'm not so certain that we are. We instead seem to be buying in, and as I said, the Senate report is illustrative of this acceptance. We're saying that, oh no, the Russians are more likely to threaten the Nordics and the Northern Europeans than they are to threaten the airspace of North America. The problem with that is it totally omits any proper understanding of collective security. I mean, if the Russians were ever to seriously threaten the European North, they have to take into an understanding that they need to take out the Americans. I mean, you can't just simply say, okay, we're going to attack Norway, Finland, and Sweden and hope that the Americans will leave us alone and understand that we're not attacking them. I mean, in what world will that happen? I mean, strategically, that is such a mistake. But that is the essence of this argumentation in Canada. Well, the Russians will never have a land invasion of Baffin Island. That's the logic. It sets up a red herring. The Russians will never invade, so therefore we don't have a threat. Well, nobody is talking about a land invasion. And in terms of Russian threats to NATO, it's not going to be a land attack. Their forces that they have now are mainly for the defensive posture around the bastion. They can probably make some incursions into Finland or into Norway. That's a possibility, but that's not where the threat is. The threat is their nuclear capabilities and their offensive delivery systems that they have in the region. No Russian commander, no Russian political leader, if it gets to the point that they actually are thinking about using kinetic weapons against Europe, would ever do it on the assumption that, well, United States and therefore North America is not going to bother us. If you're going to do it, you got to be aware that you got to do something to at least blind the Americans and hence blind us. So this whole argumentation, this mindset that somehow their security, and once again, the Senate, not to really highlight, not to be so negative about, because there's elements of the Senate report that I do like, but to make this argumentation that somehow our Arctic is more secure than the European Arctic, and therefore we don't have to be as serious about the hard security. We can focus on the human security, which we have to do. We have to do the whole issue of cultural security and environmental security. These are all elements that Canada needs to do. But our political leaders need to learn to chew gum and walk at the same time, which means this false narrative that the Canadian Arctic is somehow less a threat than the European Arctic leads us to a sense of complacency that does not allow us to take this serious of what we need to be doing.
Rob, thanks for that comprehensive overview. I think we've covered a lot of ground just now, and you've covered most of the bases, I think. So I think it's best to leave it at that. Thank you for your excellent analysis as always, and thank you for your time. Look forward to having you on the show again. Next up, Vice Admiral Retired RCN Bob Davidson. Mr. Davidson, thanks for joining me today. Pleasure having you on. To start this discussion, what would you say is the current state of NORAD, and how would you say it aligns with the current SSE framework?
Well, the current state of NORAD would suggest that it's been falling behind on virtually all of our policy areas. So there's not been a whole lot of investment in NORAD for a while, most notably in infrastructure relations. But I would start off by saying the first issue that we probably need to address in any NORAD modernization that is not being talked about a lot is BMD. So ballistic missile defense, which was turned off basically by the Martin government quite some time ago. And it was done in a kind of knee-jerk reaction at the time because the government didn't want to have a conversation about BMD, didn't want to really enter into it. And frankly, at the time, it was the days of Star Wars, and it really wasn't a realistic kind of capability yet in the minds of a lot of Canadians. And so we kind of started down this path of no BMD, and we've not returned to that. So what that has done is it's largely cut us out of a large portion of the NORAD piece, so we're not consulted on the BMD piece. We don't sit in those rooms, even though we have a deputy commander down there and we're fully connected across the board in all other areas because we were cut out of BMD. We were cut out of that whole aspect of how NORAD moved forward. So I'd say that's one of the first things that any policy change going forward on NORAD modernization ought to include is it ought to include a relook at BMD. And quite frankly, there's no reason why Canada shouldn't be all over BMD. We're going to have that level of capability potential going into the CSC, the Canadian Surface Combatant. It's just a matter of whether you buy the right missiles, but the radar capability will be there to do the detection. And so there's that piece. And if we're going to go step forward and think about NORAD modernization, then I think we want to have a talk about that. That also, since the frigates, not frigates, they're going to be a destroyer size, they're big, but the future Canadian Surface Combatant can bring that capability to Canada, then it opens the question of to what extent are we putting all maritime elements into continental defense. So NORAD has mostly been about air defense, and it has begun in the last decade and a half. It started to shift more towards a maritime surveillance piece, but it's still not a full continental defense arrangement. So again, that's another piece that we're not really fully talking about yet, but I think we're way past the point where we should be developing a full continental defense. So the same commander who commands NORAD ought to be the same commander who is U.S., Continental Command, and then it ought to be a binational command planning the defense of North America between us and our closest ally. And then it would make sense to really sort of encapsulate the full gamut of capability areas into NORAD modernization. Going back to your original question, of course, NORAD modernization. One of the things that struck me when I was director of the Joint Staff in Ottawa and I first saw the Canadian Air Defence Identification Zone, what shocked me at that time was that it didn't include the Arctic, Canadian Arctic. So it ended, basically across the tundra areas. You pull out old maps of the CADIVs, and you'll see that. And it's kind of surprising that we didn't think it was important. I mean, even Alert wasn't in an air identification zone, our base up in Alert. So it's a bit shocking to think that we didn't care. But one could argue that we didn't care because we didn't have the capability to care up until that point, both in terms of the ability to do the intercept as well as the ability to have the queuing necessary to do those intercepts in terms of surveillance capability. So a key element in NORAD modernization going forward is the over-the-horizon radar capability that's being looked at. One of the nice things about that is that we don't necessarily need to put it very far north. And so that helps with the sustainment of that capability. I mean, radars require power and, imagine trying to put these radar systems in the far north without power linkages. One of the things, so another sort of call it it's a bit of a segue and a bit of a branch out, but the whole issue of modular nuclear reactors may be an issue that needs to be addressed as we move forward as well, not directly related to NORAD modernization, but fully related to the requirement to put more power generation capability in the far north. People tend to react when you say, hey, I want to put nuclear reactors up there, but modern modular nuclear reactors have a very small footprint. They're very, very safe. They don't melt down like, big nuclear reactors do. And so you've got the potential to deliver power. And that starts to become not just simply an issue of, putting power to where we would want it for defense purposes, but then it starts to become a big sovereignty piece in terms of sustainment of capability in the north more broadly, but also communities in the north. You think about how that would dramatically affect many of the communities in the north that may be reliant on generators, and also think about how much time we spend every year shipping fuel up to Alert to sustain the base at Alert. It's a huge effort of the Canadian Armed Forces to fly fuel up there to refill the tanks and keep Alert going 24/7. So again, those kinds of energy capabilities could have a game-changing impact on how we do sustainment in the north, how we can operate different bases and capabilities up north, whether that kind of capability would allow us to have more forward basing, both for fighter jets and other capabilities in support of, Army exercises and activities with the Rangers. I mean, there's the whole range of areas where it can be significantly a game changer. So I've kind of gone off on a tangent on two areas. One is on nuclear power and one is on the maritime and ballistic missile defense. But my point is that NORAD modernization and going forward with NORAD modernization within a recast strong, secure, engaged needs to be a more holistic approach, rather than the keyhole kind of approaches that we've taken in the past in terms of unique capabilities. So we don't do a great job of thinking through the big policy changes that would be needed to actually have a modern, effective, fully functioning continental defense. And why wouldn't we want to be thinking a whole lot more about that with a rising Chinese capability and a recalcitrant and troublesome Russia at the moment?
I'm wondering what policy recommendations you might suggest to enhance the relevance and effectiveness of NORAD, or what changes you might make to existing policy wording to contribute to the improved applicability of NORAD within the defense policy update, or any kind of future update?
The BMD piece has to be a key element of the policy if you don't want to have separate rooms in NORAD contemplating the same threat. So we want to be, we would like, I think, ideally that the kimono was fully open and that we were, sharing everything between us and the United States on all areas. So that's a piece that, the other thing that we need to work on is, in terms of policy, is to really tighten up our intelligence sharing, and intelligence security arrangements. Because that's always going to be key in a 4 eyes kind of environment. We need the U.S. to have absolute full confidence that everything that they share with us, inside that kimono or under that umbrella, is fully protected and shared. And the other piece that always strikes them, is that, we love to share, but then we don't, it's that classic, I think it was, I'm trying to remember which politician who said Canadians always head for the bathroom when the bill comes. But it's true, we've not typically put our money where our mouth is. So we're good at talking the talk, but not putting our money where our mouth is. And there's a substantial investment that needs to be made here. So right now we're kind of thinking along the lines, I think, about how we can tinker with our budget to put a little bit of money there and a little money here and give the Americans a warm fuzzy that we're actually investing in across defense and including in NORAD. And we're barely scratching the surface. And we don't fool them any. I mean, they know it. They look at us and with a bit of a wry grin and say, yeah, okay, but, put your money where, start spending. And we're not really doing that. So the 2% piece that we already talked about in a previous letter out of CDAI, is a fundamental aspect of that. We need to be spending a whole lot more money. So money is a key element, a real commitment. And don't get me wrong, I'm no fool who thinks the government can shift to 2% defense spending for, 2024. This is a process that's going to take us a little while to get there. And even if we threw a ton of money, at defense tomorrow, frankly, we wouldn't be able to spend it, because we don't have enough people in the material branch. We don't have procurement policies that allow us to jump forward, quickly. So the other side of the coin on spending more money is we need to change the way we spend it, to be able to spend it more quickly. But third, we need to be realistic, and that is we shouldn't expect that we're going to get all the money right away. We need to have whatever's reasonable, a 7-year plan to get to 2% or a 10-year plan, but a commitment to a key element of that, going forward.
Thank you for your time, Bob. Appreciate you coming on. Now we will turn to Dr. James Fergusson. Dr. Fergusson, glad to have you on the program once again. Why don't we get right into it? From your perspective, what do you think are some of the most fundamental developments that occurred since the inception of SSE? And have they had much of an influence on modernization or moved continental defense forward, in your opinion?
Well, with the focus so centered upon Eastern Europe and the Ukraine, that raises questions about whether NORAD modernization will get lost as priorities may start to change. And that's my major concern. I always make the point that NORAD modernization is part of North American defense modernization. And what is needed is some clear statement on the part of the government and the department about what is North American modernization besides those commitments they've made. So we really don't know much. In terms of the NORAD modernization issue in and of itself, the capability gaps, the command seams that exist, all those pre-exist 2017. They were identified and everyone knows. 2017 brought them on the table. The funding pushed it a little further. But there's nothing really changed in the fundamental logic, both in geostrategic terms and in capability terms of the importance of modernization.
What would you say the current state of NORAD and or continental defense is, and how would you say it aligns with the current SSE framework?
Well, if you go back to SSE, NORAD modernization mixed in with North American modernization, and can also be linked to the emphasis they put on space capabilities, which would be key to modernization, is mentioned several times in SSE, but no details are provided. No funding was provided. These were rather generic, based upon, for example, at that time, the mutual commitment between Trump and Trudeau, the two governments, of the importance of modernization. So what we've seen since then is a bit more detail, at least some detail on funding, which came out in June last year and then clarified by in the speech by the defense minister in Trenton, and then clarified in a document that came out of DND, but still fairly general and generic in terms of what it said to us. And since then, we're now a year further in, there's really been no major, at least on the public level, announcements about proceeding forward. All we do know, or at least what has been argued, and again, it depends who you believe in these circumstances, that the U.S. is moving forward with their commitment for the over-horizon, the new land-based surveillance system. They're moving forward quickly. And reportedly, they are pressuring Canada to move forward quickly, at least with the first site, which will be located somewhere in southern Ontario. And of course, in the Canadian case, the concern is our regularly very slow and arduous procurement process. But there are bigger issues involved, because this is about land. Land claims are involved here, consultations, particularly with the Indigenous communities that may be involved. We don't know where the site in southern Ontario is going to go. One might think they would put it into Borden because they've got that property there. That might be one option for them. But otherwise, that's just a guess. We don't know. And it's going to be a very large site. So besides all that, in terms of any other details, we really don't know them except in general categories.
Given the deteriorating infrastructure of North American defense, including NORAD, what specific investments and modernization efforts should Canada be prioritizing?
A real big problem is, and it's a long-standing problem in the context of North American defense, is that national defense and Canadian governments, in step with the Americans as well, come from a posture or position that the defense of North America begins overseas, which means they prioritize overseas. And this historically, at least during the Cold War, was reinforced by the expectation that any attack on North America would be a nuclear one, and thus Canada, in its relation with the United States, could rely on the American strategic nuclear deterrent. That's all changed now. So the key thing is to emphasize that this is a priority, to make it clear this is a priority. It should be, in my view, the central priority. Now, when you look at beyond what they've committed to, so the two radar systems, updated command and control, and those are all very important. New defense or intercept capabilities, but very limited. And then other infrastructure, which is more related to domestic operations, I think, than it is to NORAD per se. It would be nice to see, or what we should see, is some more detail on all of these. Alongside that priority, the question of whether the defense of North America in conjunction with the United States, and hence the defense of Canada in the context of an aerospace threat, whether the reliance by Canada on air-to-air intercept capabilities is going to be sufficient. And my view is that, in fact, the government national defense needs to seriously take a look at potentially providing area or theater or point ground-based air defenses as backup layers because of the complexity of both the problem of identifying, tracking cruise missiles in flight, long-range cruise missiles, and hypersonic vehicles. And then this also raises the question of the priority or dealing with the long-standing problematic issue of missile defense as the United States integrates air and missile defense. So that should be something the update should be addressing. Alongside that, my colleague Andrea and I have noted that it's time the government took a serious look at, in discussions not just with the United States, but not alone with the United States, the status of Greenland and potentially of Iceland, in terms of the relationship with NORAD rather than NATO and European Command. So those are major issues. And we then get into questions about space-based capabilities, specifically what are they going to do? Because space-based capabilities for surveillance purposes, important for the Arctic, but even more important, communication systems for the Arctic. You have the issue of civil use. This is the importance given the lack of internet in the Arctic, problems with communications in the Arctic. You have to move data. National defense needs to make a priority, because it always talks about, like all governments do in this country, talk about whole of government. Well, they should do something along whole of government, because the natural desire of national defense will be a defense-only capability. And we can't go down that path. I don't think we should go down that path. You need to integrate them with civilian capabilities. So those are the primary things.
Well, Jim, thank you for joining me. Always a pleasure to speak with you on these matters and to gauge your expertise. Take care. To close out this week's episode, we'll turn to MGen retired Michel Lalumiere and CDA Vice Chair of Land and Space. Mr. Lalumiere, it's a pleasure having you on today. Thanks for joining me. I'm looking forward to hearing your views on NORAD modernization to close out this week's podcast. So without further ado, I'll pose to you my first question. What would you say were some of the fundamental developments that have occurred since the inception of SSE, and how do you think they have had any influence on NORAD modernization or continental defense more broadly?
SSE forced us to be beyond joint, to be all domain, to think domains, and space and cyber was definitely the biggest push and the biggest guidance, in my view, in my humble opinion, to telling the department, telling the Canadian Forces to truly operate across these domains as integrated as we can be. Of course, resourced by those resources that came with SSE, but that was and that is still today, because that's the extent policy for that, for the departments, not just E&D, but those departments that are in charge of fielding some of those capabilities, PSPC, ISET and support Treasury Board, and so forth. It's still the extent policy to say, how are you doing, CAF and D&D, in being an all-domain force? You'll read multiple times in SSE, systems of systems. So a system from one area of capabilities and operations is integrated to other systems in other areas of capabilities and integration, and it's happening seamlessly. So that's, I think, the biggest push from SSE that occurred. That effect was felt immediately by Commander NORAD, by commanders. Commander NORAD then, said, of course, he had space capabilities that he was consuming as a commander, and he had opinions on how well these capabilities were supporting him in comparison to other commanders. Did he have enough Earth observation type of sensor capabilities assigned to his missions, his primary areas of interest? Did he have enough connectivity, SATCOM? Did he have enough, et cetera, right? Global positioning, attention to some of the key areas that he's responsible for. And then beyond NORAD, when you look at the whole continent and the whole set of missions for the continent, same thing. So as those commanders responsible for those missions, how were these cross-domain capabilities serving them? So that's definitely the reflection that Commander NORAD was having continuously, and Commander CJOC as well, on how are these other domain capabilities serving me beyond the traditional capabilities from the services.
As space becomes a more contested domain, how would a more updated NORAD modernization plan need to address the need for space situational awareness and satellite defense capability?
So these domains are going through that adaptation, and of course, the adversaries are adapting the threat. So understanding, so awareness, and then defending, resiliency. So resiliency became then the primary objective. Is well, wait a minute, attack is not always the best defense. especially in these domains. So how are we going to deter the adversaries from considering this domain at all, if not first, or if not too often? So deterrence. So then back to deterrence strategies. So how do we increase or decrease the value of these potential targets to a level where it's no longer attractive or even feasible for an adversary to even consider them? And that's where I would tell you that space, that domain, after many years, decades of being really safe by its construct of the time and the capabilities that could actually that existed that could actually threaten them, needed to reinvent itself. And therefore, that's where in the recent years you would have heard the terms these capabilities, that domain needed to become more resilient. And how to do that? By transforming the capabilities that it had, by becoming a lot more dispersed in its set of capabilities, not necessarily by creating more mass, but by just rethinking how these capabilities were being delivered, being in surveillance. You have one big sensor that you're going to build only every 10 years, or you have multiple of smaller sensors that you're going to disperse. Same thing for SATCOM. Who will be your partners? Commercial sector grew at an incredible rate with incredible capabilities as well. So each satellite became options for other type of capabilities and missions through the right partnerships and so forth. So the domains both on cyber and both on space needed to adapt, and they did, and they're still doing it. And I don't think it's reversible now, and that's a good thing. I'm only quoting these two domains, but I would tell you that the information sphere, if we're going to call this a domain, is going through the same transformation as well, right? Beyond the classical domains of air, land, sea.
Mr. Lalumiere, thank you again for your time. It has been a pleasure hosting you. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.